Konnichiwa. Last week we talked about Kansai dialect, Kansai Ben, and I asked if you'd like to hear more on the subject, and a lot of you said yes, so I'm going to continue talking about Kansai Ben. First of all, I'd like to answer a question that several of you asked, which is, am I going to talk about other dialects as well? And the answer to that is not in any depth, not in the near future. And the reason for that is that the whole purpose of this channel is essentially to support people in acquiring Japanese through immersion. And everything I do here is built around that aim. My big structure course is of course useful for anybody learning Japanese, whether it's immersion or any other way. But it was created to assist people in learning Japanese through immersion. And that's why it's here on this channel. And Kansai Ben is important for immersion, because if you're watching anime, reading manga, watching Japanese television, reading books, whatever you're doing, you're going to encounter Kansai Ben early, and you're going to encounter it often. So if you can't recognize it and don't know the basics, it is going to be a problem. Now, there are a lot of dialects in Japanese, and you might ask, well, aren't the others represented in Japanese popular culture as well? And the answer is, they're not a big part of Japanese popular culture in the way that Kansai Ben is. And I told you last week how very big the Kansai area is. The Osaka urban area alone is bigger than New York, bigger than Los Angeles. It's big. And so its place in Japanese popular culture is big. And all Japanese people are familiar with basics of Kansai Ben from popular culture. Now, when other dialects are represented in popular culture, it tends to be in a much more sketchy way. For example, in the anime Boku Dake ga Inai Machi, a lot of the episodes are set in Hokkaido, and the local dialect is represented, but it's represented mostly by a few verbal tics, by the use of the sentence ender be, often followed by sa, so sentences will often end in be-sa, but it's not represented to anything like the depth that Kansai Ben is represented. Kansai Ben isn't represented fully, but quite a lot of its characteristics are known and used in popular culture. The other way that non-Kansai dialects are used, an example is Fraingu Inchi. One of the characters has a very strong Tsugaru accent, and this is actually fully represented, but the point of the scenes where it comes is essentially that the main character can't really understand them, and that is the other thing that gets done with local dialects. They can be represented fully, but the point about them is that they're not being understood or not properly understood by other characters, as they probably aren't by the audience either. And because of this, there are not going to be very many scenes like that, and there's not going to be any very serious information conveyed in the dialect. It's there essentially for its exotic qualities rather than being used as a means of communication. So, while other dialects are interesting, and if you're going to live in a part of Japan where they're used, then you certainly want to learn about them. For the purposes of general immersion, they're not necessary, and they're not even going to be very much use to you. So now let's look at some more characteristics of Kansai Ben. We're not going to try to cover everything that's used even in popular culture, but we're going to try to cover the main characteristics that you'll hear a lot of the time. So one thing to know is that in Kansai, the verb of being for animate creatures, which is iru, in standard Japanese, in Kansai is oru. Now, a Kansai speaker won't necessarily use it all the time, but you will hear this used. Now, you may know that it is also used in standard Japanese. Oru is the humble form of iru. It's keigo, it's kenjo go, humble language. But in Kansai Ben, it's not. In Kansai, it is simply the standard form of the verb of being for animate beings. And it's also used in the continuous form. So where we might say hashite iru. In standard Japanese, we say hashite oru in Kansai Ben. And just as we can, in colloquial speech, contract hashte iru to hashteru, we can contract hashte oru in Kansai Ben to hashtoru. And we see some other shifts towards the O sound in Kansai Ben, the most notable of which is in the common ending chatta, shimatta, and I've done a video on that if you're not familiar with it. In Kansai Ben this becomes shimota or shimota, not usually shimota. And akan, which we learned last week as a Kansai equivalent of dame, is often used, particularly in popular culture, as a Kansai way of making the must construction. In standard Japanese, this tends to take the form of various ways of saying if we don't, if I don't, and then followed by a negative. So we get shinakereba ikemasen, shinakereba naranai, shinakute wa dame, which can get contracted to shinakya dame, all of which means I must do. And in Kansai, that negative ending usually takes the form of akan, at least in popular culture. So we get shinakereba akan or shinakya akan. Or of course the hypertypically Kansai sena akan, in which se represents a dialectical form of suru and the na is a negative sena akan. In actual Kansai Ben it can take more varied forms, but in popular culture it will tend to end in akan because that's something that everybody recognizes as Kansai. Another very common feature is the ending nem, and this is used in pretty much the same way as the noda or nda ending in standard Japanese, and I've done a whole video about that, so if you're unclear about it, take a look at that afterwards. I'll put a link over my head. Nen is often tacked onto the end of sentences, and a very common usage of it is in the phrase nande ya nem, which is well known because it comes in Kansai comedy quite a lot. It means something like, what are you talking about? What's going on? What's all this? It's that kind of an expression. Nande ya nem. Also very common is seya. Now, seya is essentially similar to soda in standard Japanese. It has essentially the same meaning as soda, and this is often combined with nen, so we get seya nen as just agreeing with what somebody said, or seya na, often linking from what someone else said to what you said. So when someone says something, you say seya na, and then continue with what you're saying. Yes, I agree with you, and on we go. It can be seya ne, but seya na sounds more Kansai, so we often hear it in that form in popular culture. Now, another strong tendency of Kansai Ben is to abbreviate things, to drop bits out of words. So, for example, chigao becomes chao in Kansai Ben, and people will often reject an idea or a sentiment with chao chao, which is chigao chigao. No, it's different, it's not that. And similarly, omoshiroi becomes omoroi in Kansai Ben. And the hen negative ending is often reduced to just the so we often hear wakaran, which is a shortening of wakarahen, or perhaps originally wakaranu, meaning not clear, not understandable. Shiran, I don't know. Full Kansai will be shirahen, but the shortened version, shiran, is heard very often. We also hear kamahen. Now, this is what in standard Japanese would be kamawanai. So in Kansai it would be kamawahen, but it then gets cut down to kamahen, which means I don't mind, it's okay, doesn't matter. But in a positive sense, it's okay, I don't mind. Now, the S to H sound shift isn't general across Kansai Ben, but we do hear it in a few other places, notably in the transformation of san to han. So you might hear somebody's name with han on the end, and that is in fact san. But also, and interestingly here, it doesn't tend to get turned into han. A Kansai habit is to use san in aisatsu expressions like Ohayo-san or Omedetou-san, which of course in standard Japanese are Ohayo gozaimasu or Omedetou gozaimasu. And as a matter of fact, I sound a little bit Kansai in my standard Japanese there because while standard Japanese tends to cut those weak endings quite short, so they will say Ohayo gozaimasu, desu. Kansai speakers will tend to say the full desu, gozaimasu. And you often hear in shops in the Kansai region, arigatou gozaimasu. Other common Kansai expressions are honma, which is used where we'd say honto in standard Japanese. Uchi, which of course is used in standard Japanese, has an extra meaning in Kansai dialect. It's sometimes used instead of watashi by female speakers. Okini means thank you. And we often hear from shopkeepers and traders, Mairo okini, which means literally thank you for every time. Thank you for always being my customer. Donai is a good all-purpose Kansai word which means do or donna. So it's a general word for asking about something in Kansai Ben. Another common Kansaiism is mecca, which is short for mechakucha, which is standard Japanese for being in a mess. But in Kansai Ben, it means very extremely greatly. Mecha urashii. I'm really, really happy. And we even sometimes hear erai, which of course is a standard Japanese word, and it means great or noble or worthy. If somebody does something self-sacrificing or putting in a huge amount of effort, we might say, erai ne, that was wonderful of you, that was great. In Kansai Ben, it can just mean very much or a lot of. So, erai ame yan means, wow, it's raining hard. And that yan on the end of it is really like the janai in standard Japanese that doesn't make it negative but emphasizes it. And I've done a video on that if you're not familiar with that usage. So this covers quite a lot of the things that you'll commonly see in popular culture representations of Kansai Ben. And a very important thing is simply that you recognize it as Kansai Ben. So when you start having trouble understanding what someone says, you've got an idea of what's going on. And if you have any questions about Kansai expressions or Kansai structure, please feel free to put them in the comments below. And of course, I'll answer your other questions or comments too. I'd like to thank my Gold Kokeshi patrons and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. You're all my producer angels who make all this possible. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.